I recently came across some news that hit me pretty hard, that made me a little bit sentimental, even nostalgic. See, people often ask me, will you ever go back to the US? And someone recently sent me a comment saying, you know, as much as you enjoy living outside of the US now, there'll be one day when you want to go back. That's probably not the case, but there's one thing that I look back on from my childhood and early adult years in my first business that I have a sense of nostalgia about and that I can't quite get away from, and yet I know it's not good for me. And that's the kind of news that I ran into recently, something that really hit me. I grew up around the radio business. It was my father's side hustle. He worked from high school and university up until his early adult years being on the radio. And he basically had the early 1980s equivalent of a YouTube channel where he got business for his main business in finance and ended up parlaying that into a big afternoon radio show on a big station where we lived in Cleveland, Ohio. And I learned a lot of lessons about that. But in terms of radio, I enjoyed going to the station and learning about how radio stations sounded, learning something about marketing. And when I became an adult, even though I knew radio was kind of dying, I saw an opportunity to keep some of these radio stations alive, the kind my father had worked at, even some very powerful big signal radio stations that weren't making any money by basically using a different business model. And so we helped radio stations do that. But there was still a part of me that loved the sound of the big radio stations, the KFI Los Angeles, the WABC in New York, the big, powerful, what they call clear channel radio stations. Not the company called Clear Channel, if you've heard about that, but this idea of this big maximum 50,000 watt signal that, just like the station my father was on, you could hear it all over during the day, and you could hear it, this radio station in Cleveland at night, thanks to the way AM radio waves move. You could hear it all the way down in Florida. You could hear it all the way in the middle of the country. This thing went all over. And it was designed for a time when there were farms and people needed to hear the news all across their farms, when there were, later truckers and people were trucking stuff and they wanted to, stay informed at night. Obviously, a lot of that stuff has changed. Farms are largely corporatized now. There aren't nearly as many of them. There aren't as many small farmers. People have access to the internet. Truckers aren't necessarily listening to the radio for information, but I grew up around this, and I still, to this day, listen to what are called legal IDs, station imaging. It has shifted how I view branding.
100 Orchid Man. Cleveland's only news radio. Your official weather station. The home of the Indians, Cavaliers, and Browns fans. This is the big one. Now, continuing coverage on news radio.
So for a kid who often felt like he wasn't born in the right place, he didn't maybe belong where he grew up, the one thing that I still get nostalgic about is those days of the radio, and yet I know those days are gone. And so when I saw a recent news article, it hit me that sometimes you just can't go back. In Las Vegas, not that far from where I lived as an adult in Arizona, Las Vegas had one of these big booming radio stations, one of the first radio stations in Nevada called KDWN, KDON AM 720. This is a station you would drive all around, Southern California, you drive in Arizona, anywhere in the western United States, you would hear at night KDON 720. And it launched the career of people like Art Bell, who went on to host Coast to Coast AM from his trailer in Pahrump, Nevada, talking about aliens. It really created a lot of iconic, original talk radio, one of the first talk radio stations in the western United States. This big booming signal. And so imagine when I read in the news recently that KDON was going off the air. A bunch of stations had been swapped, and the new owners of KDON realized that the land the tower site was on was worth like $40 million. There's no AM radio station worth $40 million. WABC in New York, the legendary WABC in the middle of New York City, recently sold in a distress sale for something like $12 million. So this AM radio station in Las Vegas, no matter how many truckers or farms or miles of desert it covers, it ain't worth $40 million. But the land is. And so it caused me to realize, it's very sad. Basically, the station is continuing on this little FM, what they call a translator. It's not even kind of a full radio station. They're just kind of keeping it alive, but it's not nothing but it once was. There's no innovation. There's no big booming signal. You can't hear it in 8 different states at night, all across the wide open desert. There's nothing new happening at KDON. But think about, decades ago, real estate in Las Vegas and in Nevada, it wasn't worth very much. Even along the Las Vegas Strip, casinos and the land they were built on, wasn't really going for these crazy high prices. I mean, go back to the Rat Pack days. I mean, the numbers were so much smaller than they were today, and real estate was dirt cheap. And yet, having a radio station, I mean, that was really something that was valuable. And you could innovate. I mean, people would spend so much money. I mean, watch Private Parts, Howard Stern's movie. Watch any history of radio, let alone AM radio, decades ago. It was really, I mean, where people would tune in to hear. It was part of the zeitgeist. And over time, kind of like coordinates crossed. The real estate, as more people started moving to Las Vegas because New York City raised their taxes to the roof and locked them inside. California became impossible to deal with crazy high taxes and endless regulations. Even liberals are talking about the regulations now. Places in the Rust Belt just became unappealing with bad weather and taxes and corruption. And people started moving to Phoenix, to Las Vegas, to Utah, to Colorado. This part of the country became popular. I mean, Nevada was once this kind of wild libertarian state. Now it is a purple, if not a blue state. It's more Democrat-leaning because you've got people who, work normal jobs who might want to vote for Democrats. It is not some libertarian paradise. All right, let's let everybody gamble. Let's have all the degeneracy. It is not that anymore. Even the Las Vegas Strip is not that. But what it told me was, the country changed. People moved, drove up real estate prices, and yet the market of innovation went away from AM radio, went to FM radio, and then went to, things like the internet, to where one thing shut up and one thing came crashing down. I know people who own radio stations. They bought them for $5 million. Now they're selling them for $800,000. They don't happen to own the land that their towers are on, but in this case, it was a stunning reversal of what things are worth. And it made me realize that nothing ever stays the same. Some things go up and other things go down. And sometimes those things paths cross where events flip. Vegas was once, this station was once, hey, let's talk to the visitors, let's talk to the truckers, let's talk to, selling a little bit of advertising to people who work locally in this kind of place that's not that wealthy, but we have tourism. And now it's a bustling place where everyone wants to get their hands on real estate. And countries work the same. Places work the same. The place where you live could be going in the wrong direction. Other parts of the world are going in the right direction. They're crossing paths. Ever since my father was on the radio, he'd come home, I was 11, 12 years old, he'd clip out something from the Wall Street Journal, maybe he talked about it on the radio, and he'd say, hey, here's the Economic Freedom Index. Singapore or Hong Kong were always 1 and 2, and the U.S. would be, 5th or 6th or something like that. The U.S. has fallen dramatically since I was a kid, back in those days when AM radio stations were still worth something. Now, AM radio stations aren't worth anything, and the U.S. is less free than countries that in my childhood were part of the Soviet Union. And so it's an amazing reversal of fortune. And what it makes me realize is we can be nostalgic. And I can sit and I can listen to, radio station air checks from 1998 and imagine, I'm sitting back in the car. I can listen to, things from my early days of working in the radio industry, 2004 and 2005 and 2006, when there was still some pizzazz around it. And Wall Street still had a little bit of interest in the radio business. And there was still the story that I so much loved about this historical, radio business. It's all over now. Nothing I'm going to do is going to bring it back. I can listen to what it once was. I can think about it when it once was. I can enjoy reminiscing about the glory days, and yet I don't want to be that ex-football player from high school who 30 years later is still talking about the good old days while he works at a job that he wishes he didn't get because there's no growth opportunity. It's a dead-end job. If you're living in a country that's going down, you may be eventually in a dead-end situation. And the good news is there are places, just like you can flip from owning radio stations to owning the real estate underneath them, there are places where you can go. You can still enjoy the nostalgia. I can think back. I can listen to air checks of WTAM in Cleveland from 1998. I don't have to be in Cleveland to do that. And the reality is there's a lot more opportunities for me outside of Cleveland, outside of Ohio, outside of the United States, to take advantage of all the new things that are going to come up. I mean, I think that far too many people hold on to the past. I had a friend who said, you know what your superpower is? You don't have to be that. You're not that guy who says, oh, in Chicago we go here, or I only have to stay in this neighborhood, or this is all I know. Your superpower is you can adapt anywhere. You don't have to adapt the same way that I did. You don't have to go and live in all these different countries. Maybe you just want to start by buying a second house somewhere, getting a residence permit, getting a second passport somewhere else. Maybe you don't have to move yet, but you should be aware that if you're holding on to your city, your state or province, your country, purely out of nostalgia, that's going to be disastrous for your freedom, for your wealth, whether it's generating wealth or keeping it. And so sometimes it's best to keep those nostalgic memories in the past and go where you're treated best for what's working today.
More stimulating talk radio.
Wednesday, April 9th.
I think that gay marriage should be allowed if there's a ceremony kind of thing. I do not believe that gay marriages should be legal.
Are you against civil unions for gay couples?
No, I am not. I believe, but
Huh? You won't always get the straight story from politicians. That's our job. Southern California's KFI.
Los Angeles, Orange County.
Transportation provider. They ship anything, anywhere, anytime. This is the home of the Reds, 700 WLW.
U.S. Naval Observatory Master Clock. At the tone, Eastern Daylight Time, 7 hours, 0 minutes, exactly.
News, weather, and traffic for July 20th, 2010. News Radio 700 WLW, Cincinnati.
Extending help to the unemployed. This is continuing in depth. Team coverage from News.